Welcome to the Innovation Race podcast, where we meet fascinating inventors, innovators, politicians, and leaders who share the view that what's best for our country is to protect patents and keep innovation in America. Now, here's your host, Jenny Beth Martin.
Frank Gaffney is the founder and executive chairman of the Center for Security Policy and the host of the nationally syndicated show Secure Freedom Radio. He's authored over a dozen books, and he served as President Reagan's Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy. I've known Frank for many years, and he really understands national security. I'm so thrilled to have him on this podcast. But before we go to the interview, remember, our documentary film, Innovation Race, is coming to select theaters on November 16, 2022. For more information about that, go to innovationracemovie.com. And now, here's Frank Gaffney. Frank, let's just get started talking about this Committee on Present Danger, China. Was there a Committee on Present Danger before in our history? Tell us a little bit about that.
There have actually been a couple of iterations of it, the first and most important of which was in the Cold War. And I think it played a really important role in helping a guy who actually was a member of the Committee on the Present Danger by the name of Ronald Reagan devise a strategy for dealing with what he called his time's existential threat to freedom, namely to stop propping it up, it being the Soviet Union, and to actually roll it back and defeat it. And that, in turn, the strategy that the Committee on the Present Danger helped him develop, turned into a platform on which he ran in 1980, saying to the American people, I want a mandate to do this. He got it overwhelmingly, and then he executed on it. And the rest, as they say, is history. So it's an inspiration, really, to what we think needs to be done with respect to our time's existential threat to freedom, which is, of course, the Chinese Communist Party.
Okay, I find that interesting that you're making a comparison to what America faced with the Soviet Union, and in the film Innovation Race, we do the same thing. We talk about at the very beginning, we begin talking about the space race between America and the Soviet Union from the 60s, and then we compare that space race to what we're facing right now with the innovation race. And I think there are a lot of comparisons between America and the Soviet Union versus America and China and the CCP. Part of you are an expert on national security and foreign affairs. One of the things that we discuss briefly in the film is China's ability to use what they call civil-military fusion. And we go through it a little bit, but the film's only 70 minutes, so we can't talk about it very much. Could you explain more about what civil-military fusion is?
Sure. Let me just say, first of all, though, it's a terrific film.
Thank you.
I'm so proud of you and the work that you've done that has really borne such great fruit. Secondly, you're right about that space race business. What was so important about it really was when it began, it started with Sputnik. It started with a shock to the American people that the Soviet Union, which we considered sort of backwards, definitely increasingly a threat, had beat us in putting a satellite in orbit in space.
Right.
And it kick-started an American innovation and commitment to respond to what wasn't a danger so much in its own right, but the possibility that the same systems that put that in space could be used to attack us, namely intercontinental ballistic missiles. Flash forward. Today, and to your point about civil-military fusion, this is just one example of why the Chinese Communist Party is a vastly more dangerous enemy than the Soviet Union was, even in its heyday. Civil-military fusion is a Chinese expression that describes essentially the whole of society being brought to bear to advance the agenda of the CCP, as we call it, namely global domination. And unfortunately, for that to be accomplished, they have to get rid of the United States of America, which is the single biggest impediment to its realization. Using all instruments of state power, the so-called private sector, the civil and the military, in a concerted effort to accomplish whatever it is, innovations, production, research and development, and actual operation of capabilities that are inherently at best dual use,
right,
if not primarily for the military, to achieve, well, the end of the United States. And another important term that the Chinese have developed is unrestricted warfare, that they bring all of that civil militarily fused capability to bear to accomplish against us.
And traditionally with warfare, what is the difference between unrestricted warfare and restricted warfare?
The term comes from a book that was authored by two senior colonels in the People's Liberation Army back in 1999. And I think it describes something that had already been put into train, but certainly at least since 1999, we've been on notice in the form of this book that the Chinese have a doctrine in an era where they could not compete with us militarily to nonetheless be using whatever instruments they did have to take us down. And so it refers to essentially non-kinetic forms of warfare, as they say. Things like economic warfare, of which I would argue the patent strategy is a key piece. Political warfare, subversion, espionage, elite capture, the various techniques for hollowing out our industrial base and the rest. And interestingly enough, they mentioned also biological warfare. So I kind of put that in a gray zone between non-kinetic and very much kinetic warfare, and I think we've seen that one playing out with COVID of late. But you put all this together, and what you see is a very determined, long-term, patient, systemic approach to defeating our country, using, as I say, whatever instruments, civil and ultimately military, that are at their disposal.
It's very alarming to think that they want to defeat our country. It's not something that I think most Americans even sit around thinking about, that we have enemies who truly do wish us harm and wish our country harm. I think sometimes we're so deeply divided as a society that we actually are a little bit very self-centered and forget that there's this whole other world and they don't all like us. And it's not because we eat meat. It's because they actually want to defeat us and to control us.
Absolutely right. Look, if I could just tease that out a little bit, the great thing about democracies and why historically they generally don't create conflicts is because people, when they have the ability to do so, are preoccupied with their own internal affairs and lives and families and fortunes. So we don't focus so much on these foreign concerns, and especially if our government isn't telling us that we need to be focused on it, all the more we tend to ignore them. And this is the problem with the Chinese Communist Party. Shortly before that book was introduced, a guy by the name of Deng Xiaoping, I think features in your film, is one of the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party back in the early 1990s, said when the Reagan strategy for defeating the Soviet Union succeeded, that the Cold War with the United States and the Soviet Union is over. The Soviets lost, and a new Cold War has begun between the United States and China will win. And he put in motion something that came to be called the hide and bide strategy for accomplishing that win, again, before China was strong enough militarily to do it the old-fashioned way. It took the form of unrestricted warfare, but I would argue that a key piece of it, the Hyde piece of it, was to create the impression in the world, and most especially in the West and here, that China just wants to be another nation, that it wants to be part of the civilized world. If it just gets rich, it will be, maybe a competitor, but at least a business partner. And American businesses and American officials of both parties bought into it. The public was induced to believe there's no problem with China. You can buy all of your stuff from China. There's no problem with having them out innovating us.
And no problem with offshoring our industry.
No, absolutely not. And I mean, literally in some cases, as you know, actually physically having entire factories removed from the United States and reconstructed in China.
Right.
A perfect example of that problem. So all of these things are now long-standing. They've been assiduously pursued, and whether we're paying attention to them or not, they have changed dramatically the complexion of the challenges that we face in the world, and they will affect all of us. Well, heavens knows if we didn't get that message with what I consider to be, and actually a team that we put together to study this, a biological warfare attack against our country in the form of COVID-19. We're really not going to be attentive to the dangers we're facing.
One thing that I think that COVID, maybe I'm overstating this, but I was thinking about how you said we had our Sputnik moment with the Soviet Union. I think that we may look back and say we had our COVID moment with China, and it's almost a comparison, not so much necessarily because of the biological warfare implications of it, though that may be what we look back and see. But I think that what we're also going to see is that the lockdowns and that China had, that America had, but the lockdowns that China had and continues to have right now have so severely affected our economy that they've disrupted our supply chain. We've had empty shelves. We've had empty shelves on things that are nice to have, but you can live without, like paper towels. But we've had empty shelves with other things that are much more critical to our ability to survive, including key medications and pharmaceuticals. And so I think it needs to be a wake-up call. The weather and I'm not downplaying what you said, but sometimes Americans are slow to catch up, and they're not quite ready to hear all of the shocking truth about some situations. So whether they're completely ready to hear that or not, I think they should at least realize we cannot be solely dependent on a singular other country for our supply chain. It needs to be diversified. You can, if you want to be a company that says we're going to have a national, an international supply chain, well, then actually make it international and not just bi-national, like not just America and China, but
especially a country that is hostile to you.
Yes, exactly.
This is absolutely insane. And your point about medicines is just, of course, one particularly egregious example of this, where literally we don't manufacture penicillin in this country anymore. Most of the ingredients for most of our pharmaceuticals, generic especially, now come from one source, China. Some from India, but mostly from China. And the thing about it, Jenny Beth, is that the Chinese have made no secret that they are willing to use such supply chain dominance to advance their agenda.
And that's what happens when you're fusing civil, medicine and economics with the military aspect of it. Mm-hmm. And I think that you have to look at what they're doing through that lens. And it's easy as Americans who, when I'm saying they're not quite ready to look at the facts laid bare, because sometimes it's shocking and it changes your perspective.
There's a just, if I could quickly, there's a quote attributed to Leon Trotsky, a Bolshevik in the Soviet Union, that you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you.
Right.
And I think this is one of the things that I hope we can get back to in the course of this conversation, that we have got to insist our leaders do, because we may be interested in our, personal matters, our economic affairs and businesses and so on.
Right.
But there is now a very clear and present danger from this existential threat of our time, which is worse than any we've faced before. And it's many manifestations. Some of them have already touched us. And the COVID thing is a prime example of it.
Right.
And, the trouble is, in the analysis that our Team B3, as we call it, did of this virus, when the U.S. government just couldn't tell us whether it came out of nature or whether it came out of a biological warfare laboratory.
Tell us.
Or did not want to. We did a second opinion on it. And one of the things that we concluded is there's no evidence it came out of nature.
Right.
There's a lot of evidence it came out of a biological warfare laboratory. However it got out of there, what is indisputable is the Chinese disseminated it worldwide. They were not allowing travel within China, but they wanted people from Wuhan to go everywhere else, confident that that would result in what we've seen, a pandemic. But your other point, which I just wanted to come back to quickly, the China model, as it was called, was the other part of this biowarfare attack. It involved getting the World Health Organization and its friends, Bill Gates and others around the world, to all embrace the idea that the way you needed to respond to this, CCP virus, I think it's properly called, was by quarantines, by mask mandates, by lockdowns, by
following the CCP's model.
Forcing people to take inadequately tested vaccinations, enforcing those with passports, digital passports. All of these are part and parcel of the Chinese efforts to impose their system on everybody else. And the thing is that, as you kind of alluded to, what they accomplished was not only incalculable harm to our economy, but they also did harm to our constitutional republic and our freedoms as well. The society has been impacted. And again, this is just part of that unrestricted warfare.
Right. And it's made segments of our society, I can't say our whole society, but it's made segments of our society begin to be more comfortable with such dominant tyrannical control, whereas thankfully we've had other segments and states, it seems to be some states versus other states, and major cities, some major cities versus others, that have just said absolutely not. We're not bringing that kind of tyranny here, and people are we're going to educate them, and then they're going to make their own decisions, and we trust the people to be smart enough to do that, which is what our country is based on. It's based on trusting people to elect our representatives.
That's exactly right. And it is a representative constitutional republic that we hold dear, and it's imperiled when these kinds of control mechanisms are insinuated into our society, and in the name of public health or in the name of protecting somebody else, you go along with this subordination of your freedoms, your constitutional rights, for that matter, to the dictates of wealth in the form of Tedros Ghebreyesus, the Director General of the World Health Organization, essentially a pawn of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's what we've done.
And it is alarming. One thing that I thought of as we've been speaking, and I don't want to go on a huge rabbit trail about this, but
it's an occupational hazard. You can go into a lot of them when you talk about China.
But when we're talking about China and we're thinking about the kind of risk that we have, especially when you think of the supply chain type risk, one of the things that I've been thinking about over the last couple of months as the elements of the Green New Deal are being passed into law, and there's this at the moment this lurch towards electric vehicles and much more dependency on our grid. Our grid is as at risk as the pharmaceutical industries are. If you have a problem with the grid, without going into all of the kind of problems that we could have with the grid, getting the parts to repair it, you can't just, they're not manufactured in America anymore. And so you're dependent on parts that may have to be manufactured in China or elsewhere in the world, and getting them all the way back across the ocean here. We've already seen firsthand just how long that supply chain takes to actually, the just-in-time supply chain, how long it's taking before it hits our shelves. And it's just one of those things that I've thought, as we're talking here, we have to be wise when we're thinking about that push, because they're not above using things in a militaristic fashion, and we don't even think in it, our businesses and just in general, Americans aren't thinking in those terms.
Yeah, it's not that they're not above it; they are doing it.
Right.
They've
That's
actually
true.
withheld rare earth minerals, for example,
Right.
from Japan for the purpose of trying to devastate their economy. Look, this is such an important point. Just a quick excursion. In addition to increasing our reliance on China for batteries and wind turbines,
Right.
and solar panels,
Right.
the Green New Deal also will involve our becoming more reliant upon them for another key component of our electric grid, that without which it simply doesn't work, which
Right.
is these high voltage transformers.
Right.
Unbeknownst to most of us, there are 300 Chinese high voltage transformers in our grid today. And as you say, we don't manufacture them. We don't have the means of replacing them. And what we've established, in at least one instance that I know of, is we've found built into those transformers hardware backdoors that allow them to be destroyed,
just like we've
on
seen
command,
with backdoors
remotely
into
from
social
China.
media companies and everything else. So people
You
who might
bet.
be going, that seems very far-fetched. We also have learned social media companies have had backdoors for our own government to get in.
Yeah. Well, and they've also had Chinese agents working
sure.
for them in the case of Twitter most recently.
Right.
Yeah. But your point is so well taken here, and that is that if you're concerned about the future of our country, let alone the future competitiveness of our economy, this is a formula for disaster that
Right.
we are depending, again, not just on a single country, but on a hostile country.
A communist
country dedicated to our destruction for so much of our, basic necessities of life, like the electric grid, to say nothing of the things that make it qualitatively desirable to be an American.
So one of the things that we were talking about is that the question of whether we are at war with China, or more specifically, China is at war with us.
The Chinese Communist Party, I think there's no mistaking it. And again, it's not just the rhetoric, it's the actions as well. And what we are seeing increasingly is, in warnings like that unrestricted warfare book, or even more dramatically, in May of 2019, shortly before the outbreak of the pandemic, by the way, on the pages of People's Daily, which is the Chinese Communist Party's principal propaganda outlet, there was a declaration published of a people's war against the United States. Well, what does that mean?
Right.
It means that every instrument of the Chinese Communist Party's regime, its civilian sector, its military sector, will be brought to bear in a war against the United States. So, I mean, this may not be terribly welcome news, but we ignore it at our peril.
Right. We need to make sure when we're putting the description together for this podcast that we have a link to that. So we'll make sure we loop back to you to get that link.
Sure.
So now, all right, we've talked about China as a whole and civil-military fusion and unrestricted warfare. How do you think, as we look at intellectual property and patent rights specifically, which is what Innovation Race is really, that is a segment, there's so much that we can look at, and that's the segment we looked at. What do you think about the innovation space and the technology advances and the technological advances that we've seen from China, and what could be happening here in America, especially with the fact that they've got more patents than people patenting in China right now than in America?
Yeah. As I say, I thought the film was really well done, but particularly important was something that I was kind of aware of back in the 2011 timeframe, as I recall, but just didn't have the bandwidth to focus on, and people who were worried about it, and they impressed upon me that I should be worried about it, but it just sort of got away from me. But it was that moment when we started really changing our patent system, something that had been, as you document so brilliantly, central to the success of this nation from its founding going forward, because of the rewarding of innovation that was part and parcel of its original structure. I remember the argument being made at the time, and I don't think it was so much by the Chinese, though I know they were in the mix, but we were being told, particularly the Europeans, wanted us to have the same basic patent system that they did, and that we needed to bring ours into conformity with international standards and best practices and all of that. And I had enough people saying to me, this is a disaster, to really make it very worrying. And what you've demonstrated and what we've now seen, to the point of your question, is not only the way we were subverted by being induced to do that to our patent system, but how the Chinese have recognized the brilliance of our original approach and now recreated it for themselves. And lo and behold, predictably, it's having the same effect that it used to have for us. The cumulative impact of all of that, I think, is hard to overstate. The national security, as well as the commercial competitiveness of our country, rests on being at least equivalent to, and generally, more importantly, superior to anybody else in terms of technology. And this, and you, I think, do a commendable job of this. This affects so many different aspects of our economy and of our, innovativeness. It's hard to overstate how, the impact of it will be, particularly over time. And as I said earlier, the thing about the Chinese is that they're patient. If they can get things done quickly, great. But if they can't, they'll take time to do it, hide and bide, and wear us down and supplant us and take us over. So I think that what we need in terms of, I think, your fundamental recommendation, which is to get back to first principles and to reestablish the kind of patent environment where we are once again rewarding people for the patents that they come up with or pursue, for the innovations, more to the point, that prompt them, and doing it as a priority for national security, as well as, I say, for commercial competitiveness.
Right. In a moment, I want to talk about what you think solutions are, because you have ideas for solutions, not just with patents, but with the entire issues we've talked about regarding the CCP. One of the other things that the film really focuses in on is the importance of Taiwan. And we did this long before the film was already produced, long before Speaker Pelosi went to visit Taiwan in recent weeks of this recording that we're doing today. One of the things that I have thought about over the last year or so, the film took a long time to get to production, longer than any other documentary we've done, largely because of the lockdowns and travel restrictions that we faced. We really wanted in-person filming, not a bunch of Zoom interviews. So it took longer. And so I've watched and learned about just how important Taiwan is for any of us to use any of these electronic devices that we use, or in cars, or in much more important pieces of equipment than our phones, even though I would say our phones are very, very important pieces of equipment. So I began to understand the importance of Taiwan. And then this year, as Russia started very aggressively working to change its boundaries and its borders, which it has been doing since before Trump was president, though they did not do that during Trump's presidency. I just started thinking, if Russia thinks it can get away with changing its borders, China's going to think that it can get away with changing its borders, and it's going to take Taiwan. It would want to take Taiwan because there's a strategic advantage to controlling all of those chips. And I've mentioned this to you, and I've mentioned it to other national security experts, because I'm not a national security expert, but I just started thinking, when countries try to change their boundaries and their borders, that is oftentimes what wars are about. That is what wars are about. And it concerns me that the very same thing could happen with Taiwan. Can you maybe elaborate on some of that and what you're seeing and concerns you might have about Taiwan? And we highlight it in the film, but you know more about it than I do.
Well, let me just say, one of the things I've always admired about you is you may not be a national security expert, but you understand the importance of it, and you care about it, and you recognize that you can't leave it out of the public policy, focus of your terrific organization, among other things. I think that we've had a wake-up call, a Sputnik moment, if you will, about Taiwan. The Chinese already have redrawn the boundaries. They say Taiwan is part of China.
Right.
And unfortunately, over the years, they've gotten successive American presidents of both parties to at least implicitly say so as well. This is the so-called one China policy. We say we don't want, the actual boundaries, if you will, to be redrawn unilaterally, but implicitly, at least, we have signaled to the Chinese, we agree that there's just this one China, and how it actually is formalized is supposed to be a matter of negotiation, not violence. But, as you know, the thing that preceded Putin's invasion of Ukraine, rewriting the boundaries with Ukraine, as you put it, was he went to Beijing. At the start of I call them genocide games, the Olympics. And clearly, what was done there was to formalize a so-called no-limits partnership between the two countries, in which Xi Jinping green-lighted what is now effectively a vassal state, Russia, the much less powerful partner in this partnership, to go into Ukraine, provided he waited until the Olympics were over. And I don't think that they've been particularly pleased with how this has played out. I think they've learned a lot of lessons from it. But I also think that when Putin and Xi got back together again for the first time since that meeting in February, just a few weeks ago, in the course of meetings they were having in the stands, as they call them, I'm pretty sure, green-lighted China's invasion of Taiwan.
Wow.
Or at least its seizure through other means, if not through that form, a blockade at a minimum. Now, again, I assume that the understanding was we're not going to do it right away. In Xi's case, I think it's after the Party Congress coming up in October.
Which is when?
October 16th.
Okay.
But whenever it is, I think it's clear Russia will support that move. And probably that means not only the problem that you've identified, which is imperiling our access, we talk about supply chain dependencies, our access to the critical high-end silicon chips manufactured mostly for the world in Taiwan.
Right.
But actually, I'm pretty sure, and our experts on our Committee on the Present Danger of China, I think, agree, if it goes that way, that China is prepared to attack not just Taiwan and probably other of our allies in the region, notably Japan, but also the assets, the personnel, and maybe even the territory of the United States as well. So these are the sorts of things that move this whole problem of an unrestricted, non-kinetic warfare that's bad enough, especially since we're not paying attention to it, into a whole new realm. And what makes particularly urgent, I think, the need to get our leadership clear-eyed about what's going on here and truthfully reporting to the rest of us about it so that we can be prepared as best we can for what may be coming.
Okay, so how do you think that we should be prepared, and what are the solutions that you think we should be looking at?
Well, we put together something we call the brief, which
Okay.
I would commend to your audience. It's available in a video format, about a half an hour, at ccp@war.com.
Okay.
And it basically walks them through the fact that the Chinese Communist Party treats its own people horrifically. And why that matters, or should, to us is not just out of a humanitarian concern, but because if, as they say, they intend to conquer us, they will certainly be treating us at least as badly, if not worse. So we better pay attention to that. And then we talk about how they are pursuing that goal. And we've touched on a number of points related to it, the unrestricted warfare of the people's daily people's war and so on, Deng Xiaoping's hide and bide strategy. But what we think needs to be done about it in light of where we are now, with our dependencies, with the growing talk of kinetic war, is we need 6 steps taken.
Okay.
The first of which is we need to be clear about the nature of this enemy. It is a mortal threat, an existential threat to freedom in general and to us especially. We need to put the country, this country, on a war footing comparable to the one the Chinese are putting their country on, in a whole of society way, by the way. Third, we need to specifically disengage from the Chinese Communist Party and the ways that we are currently doing business with them, including through our patents. Fourth, we need to rebuild our military because we've been at war now for 20-odd years of the kinetic kind. In a lot of other places, it's not in great shape, and we're facing even greater problems thanks to some of the Biden administration's policies. Fifth, I think it's imperative that we purge, particularly from political office, but ideally leadership more generally, people who have been compromised by the Chinese Communist Party. I mentioned elite capture. It has aggressively and systematically and patiently pursued the suborning of people in business, in finance, in the media, in academia, in Hollywood, and not least, of course, including the Commander-in-Chief of the United States, Joe Biden.
But now, clarify what you mean by purge, because we don't want anyone to get the wrong idea that you mean...
They need to be removed from power. I don't know how you can contend with, in a wartime situation, the fact that you have a hostile enemy and you have people who are deeply compromised by it in office. making your policies. So, I mean, it's not physical violence by any means, but
just want to make sure we're clear on that. But
it's a really vital point, and I don't, have any illusion how hard this would be because there are legions of them.
Right.
But the reality is, in time of war, you simply can't have your side led by or even populated by people who are really playing for the other team. And finally, a key piece of this, Jenny Beth, and it's hard to overstate the importance of it. One of the things that our Committee on the Present Danger of China has really focused on is we're financing all of this. Unbeknownst to most Americans, if they're in the stock market, they've got money in pension plans or 401k plans or mutual funds or exchange traded funds or index funds or some other investment vehicle. Chances are some of those elite captured Wall Street guys, notably but not exclusively Larry Fink at BlackRock, have been putting a portion of their portfolios in Chinese companies. And this is because of civil-military fusion, something that is essentially aiding and abetting and enabling the threat we face from China. So those are the 6 steps that we think need to be taken. Stop funding the enemy, clean up our house, rebuild our military, disengage from the Chinese economically and in every other respect, get on a war footing, and recognize the threat.
Those are pretty powerful steps, and none of them are going to be easy.
Right.
But the most important thing is acknowledging we actually have a problem.
Yes.
And I do think that Americans, especially because of COVID, see China differently now than they did, say, in 2017 when President Trump started calling China out. And even the Biden administration has not backed down off of what Trump did with that. And as much as they maybe not haven't gone
to some extent.
They haven't gone as aggressively, but they haven't just turned around and said, "Oh no, they were completely wrong about their concerns about China." Yes. And
but for example, one of the facets of that is that the Chinese are using Uyghurs for slave labor.
It's horrible.
And this administration is now enabling that, especially, amazingly, at the same time it's talking about, the Green New Deal and becoming more self-reliant and having solar panels manufactured in this country. One of the things that those slave labor factories are churning out is solar panels that are now being brought back here without the Trump tariffs on them. So, it's a somewhat less than perfect record by even that measure, but on so many other aspects, Jenny Beth, what really worries me, if I had a critique of this administration, it is that basically every policy it's pursued has 2 things in common. One, they're bad for America.
Right.
And 2, I think without exception, they've benefited the Chinese Communist Party.
So it seems that this administration is acknowledging there's a problem. They've done that. They've said there's a problem, but it's almost lip service and to the problem, and then they just continue to feed the problem, fuel the problem.
I think lip service is the right word for it, and I'm not even sure it's as fulsome as it should be if they were being, rigorous about it. But more to the point, the actions do not conform to the rhetoric. And that's what is emboldening the Chinese Communist Party, I'm afraid, with respect to Taiwan and on so many of these other issues as well.
It's quite alarming and a situation that we have to continue to pay very close attention to. Is there anything else you think that we should cover before we close out?
Could I just mention one thing, and
Please.
It might be a rabbit trail that you don't want to go down either, but I think one of the things that's really just come to my attention is something that I believe the president did back in April in the form of an executive order. And when you talk about innovation, this is particularly ominous, I think. He is now putting all government agencies on notice that they need to now embrace a bioengineering, biotechnology program that looks like it's been taken from the pages of the World Economic Forum's transhumanist agenda. And to the extent that this has the most sweeping and really dangerous implications for our society, for our freedoms, for our humanity even.
Right.
It warrants, I think, close scrutiny. And I hope that as part of, the work that you're doing on encouraging good innovation in this
Right.
country and ensuring that it isn't impeded, that you also be looking at this, because I have the feeling that there's stuff that will be coming out from under those rocks when they're turned over that is going to be very, very ominous and very worrying to the American people.
I think that you're right about that. I think there's a lot when we're looking at the situation with China. There's a lot at stake. Our freedom is at stake. Our survival as a country is at stake.
Yes.
And paying attention to the fact that there is a very real issue is one of the things. A present danger.
Mm.
One of the things that I hope that the film is able to highlight for people, and looking at just one sliver of the whole problem that we face.
Yeah, it's a microcosm of the larger problem, and I, again, salute you for doing it.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you very much, and thanks for being here to go through all of this
Privilege.
today.
Thank you.
So we are joined by Frank Gaffney, the executive chairman of the Center for Security Policy. We'll make sure that we include links to his website and the solution, the brief that he mentioned, along with a few of the other articles that he mentioned in the notes for this podcast. And thank you for being with us today. I'm Jenny Beth Martin with Tea Party Patriots and the executive producer of Innovation Race. Our film, Innovation Race, is coming to theaters on November 16th, 2022. For more information about the documentary, go to innovationracemovie.com.
The Innovation Race podcast is hosted by Jenny Beth Martin and produced by Kevin Mooneyhan, Lori Heiselman, and Andy Peterson. Luke Livingston directs the video podcast. Innovation Race Podcast is a production of Tea Party Patriots Action. For more information, visit teapartypatriots.org. That's teapartypatriots.org.